When talking about Serbia, the country is talked about in the context of its many historical periods. Be it its golden age during the 1300s, its struggle for survival during the First World War, or the dark ages of the 90s, when its regime decided to do, things. Yet, very little is ever mentioned about arguably the most interesting period the country found itself in, that subsequently followed the toppling of the 90s regime and the changes that were brought with it, the early 2000s. Now, it's difficult to talk about Serbia and its position at the dawn of the millennium without first talking about the 20th century and the shitstorm that was the breakup of Yugoslavia. Since Yugoslavia's conception in 1918, Serbia has been the most influential state in the kingdom and the region as a whole, more often than not leading politics in a Serb-centric way and pushing policies that favored the Serbs more than other ethnic groups within the kingdom. This type of approach in operating the nation gradually kindled resentment amongst the other ethnic groups found in Yugoslavia, who would attempt to rid themselves of the Serbs during the Second World War by allying themselves with some questionable characters. Nevertheless, by the end of the war, Yugoslavia was taken over by a socialist government and strongman dictator Josip Broz Tito, who corrected Serbia's mistakes within the federation and limited the then republic's influence by decreasing Serbia's executive and legislative power in the other republics and its own provinces of Vojvodina and Kosovo. In general, nationalism as a whole relating to the individual republics that made up the country was curbed, and the idea of brotherhood, unity, and pan-South Slavic nationalism was promoted instead. But as you should know by now, Tito's ideas for Yugoslavia were sent down to hell alongside him when he died in 1980. Almost immediately after his death, the country found itself in a big pickle. During his time in office, Tito structured the country to be more or less held together by him, and him alone. Which, to be fair, worked alright if you take the tons and tons of IMF loans he acquired and the botched structuring of the economy out of the equation. However, the problem was he did not leave an heir to continue his work, and at the same time, the mismanagement problems he produced were coming back to roost. So, to solve this problem, regional strongmen from each republic started to pop up. Whilst Tito propagated a policy of pan-Slavic patriotism and suppressed local tribalist nationalism, they did the exact opposite. Now, the majority of the republics desired for greater autonomy and looser ties to the Federation. However, Serbia was a bit different. Although every republic propagated their country and people over everyone else, Serbia had an upper hand. First and foremost, the capital of the Federation was set in Serbia, and as such, the Republic garnered more political power and influence than the others. On top of that, although no ethnic group was a clear majority in the country, the Serbs were the plurality, making up 36% of the population in 1990. As such, Serbia desired to instead increase centralization and have the federal government, greatly controlled by them, exert more and stronger influence over the others. As you can imagine, this did not sit well with the other republics, and one by one they decided to declare independence. In a way to preserve as much influence and power as it could, Serbia then decided to fund and support the local Serb minorities from the respective republics, who also felt threatened by ethnic nationalism radiating from their republics' governments, to secede and join with them. This did not sit well with the newly independent republics, and the war took hold over the Western Balkans yet again. Initially, with the breakout of the war, international public opinion was mixed. In the West, you had countries like Germany, who supported Croatia in its efforts to secede from Yugoslavia, and you had nations like France, who supported the preservation of Yugoslavia. However, that quickly changed. As Serbia was essentially in control of the federal government, it was able to take control of the vast majority of the military supplies and finances. Although the Republic of Serbia itself rarely used its military directly against either Croatia or Bosnia, it did use its resources to support the separatists who increasingly went overboard in their campaign, ethnically cleansing countless towns and villages and purposely targeting civilians. Now, it's important to note that the Serb separatists in this conflict weren't anything unique. Both the Croats and Bosniaks did the same crimes as them, for which everyone in these godforsaken lands would end up in front of a judge at the Hague Tribunal for war crimes, like a bunch of elementary elementary school delinquents being sent to the principal's office. What made the Serbs different was that they were significantly better funded and were making larger gains, via which the frequency and amount of war crimes ended up being quite larger. With their gains, the rebels and paramilitaries would also keep getting cockier with what they could get away with and organize essentially genocide against the Bosniaks via the events of Srebrenica and the numerous concentration camps like Omarska. As you can imagine, this didn't garner the Serbs nor Serbia any favors, and any of the international support and goodwill the country initially had almost immediately disappeared due to this. Quickly, the separatists and Serbia got heavily sanctioned by almost everyone and their mothers, with even Russia, Serbia's traditional ally, voting in favor of totally embargoing the country. Things started to settle down a bit after 1995, when the war in Bosnia was concluded and the West intervened. Sanctions slowly started to be lifted, some trade and the transition to privatization of state industries was able to resume. But yet again, everything went to hell when war in Kosovo broke out. Although Serbia claimed it was fighting to protect the Serbian minority from Albanian terrorists and secessionists, much like in the previous two wars, the military went in guns blazing and targeted civilians, displacing about 1.3 million Kosovars, killing between 7,000 to 9,000 civilians, and sexually assaulting between 10 to 20,000 women. However, unlike the wars in Bosnia and Croatia, where the Serbian government was just financing and supporting the Serbs from the seceded republics and didn't directly commit these crimes here, in Kosovo it was Serbia personally who did this under Milosevic. Serbia was completely isolated, with even Russia, again one of Serbia's best traditional allies, begging Milosevic to surrender and siding to a great extent with the West. In just a couple of years, the country was completely isolated from practically the entirety of the world, and just as the sanctions were leaving, they immediately returned, followed by a US-led NATO bombing campaign against the entire country, similar in fashion to what NATO had done previously in Bosnia when it targeted the Serbian rebels. And as you should know by now, the Serbian army got absolutely devastated by the campaign, capitulating in 3 months. However, maybe if they didn't have regular earbuds in, but Raycon with their awareness mode on, maybe they could have heard the planes coming whilst listening to Turbofolk at the same time, and put up a longer fight. But you don't have to make the same mistake as them, as Black Friday is just around the corner and Raycon is having a major sale offering their earbuds for up to 30% off. And let me tell you, if you're gonna get yourself a new pair of earbuds, they're amazing. Raycon sponsored me first 3 months ago in August and sent me a pair of their everyday earbuds, which I've been using religiously ever since. I mean, just look at how worn out the case is. I literally take them everywhere I go. On the way to the bar, to the gym, on planes, whilst working out, and everywhere and anywhere in between. I've even recommended them to my mom and she adores them. And what's not to love? Raycon has an absolutely amazing battery life lasting 32 hours, allowing you to connect to not just one device at once, but 2, and some of the best noise cancellation I've ever experienced on a pair of earbuds, which is perfect for long haul flights with babies that cry the entire 8 hours from Chicago to Zurich. Trust me, I should know. In addition to this, they charge incredibly quick. In just 10 minutes you already have 90 minutes of battery life, and they are even weatherproof and sweat resistant, making them great for the gym. I also love the protective case, not just because it looks cool as hell, but because it also supports wireless charging. I genuinely can't recommend them enough, as I thoroughly enjoy using them, and you can too, as their quality easily rivals that of other big name premium earbuds, but they're half the price. And with the Black Friday / Cyber Monday deal, you get an additional discount of up to 30% off. So go to buyraycon.com/ironically to get up to 30% off, or click the link in the description. Now, as all this was going on in Serbia, fundamental shifts were happening within the country itself. First and foremost, the economy, as weak as it was prior to the wars breaking out, completely and utterly tanked, exploding into bits and pieces. Years of embargoing Serbia, restricting trade, and 3 months of bombing civilians and military industry nuked the majority of employment opportunities out of existence. By 1999, 1/3 of Serbia's population was left unemployed and plunged into economic turmoil. However, those with a job were not safe either, due to the staggering inflation that gripped the country. Since its inception, the country struggled with inflation. However, between 1992 and 1994, the nation's moneypreneurs, heavily affected by the sanctions, went into overdrive, printing as much cash that the monthly inflation rate reached 313 million% in 1994, completely and utterly wiping out any and all savings people had that were not in foreign currency, as well as pensions given to retirees. So even if they were lucky to have a job at all, the money they were making from it was less in value than literal toilet paper. Paired with this was a general lack of goods. Many stores laid barren with nothing on display except for empty shelves. Most strikingly, manufactured goods and petrol became extremely hard to come by due to the NATO intervention destroying factories and many oil refineries, which, alongside creating a lack of goods, also created problems with providing winter heating. This opened up a huge black and gray market within the country, where thousands of smugglers start to operate by running the border with neighboring countries and importing goods. Although initially this was just regular people trying to survive by trading, many found great success in these commercial endeavors. They were so successful, in fact, that they started to grow their smuggling business and transform them into proper smuggling syndicates. Just with any story regarding trade in the black market, these syndicates expanded their commercial expertise onto drugs as well, because if you're already risking your ass over goods, might as well go all the way and sell heroin. The government and a large chunk of the Serbian political elite took note of this and started directly sponsoring and utilizing these newly formed gangs for their own benefit, not just to make profit in trading regular goods and drugs, but also weapons smuggling, elimination of political and trade opponents, and extortion. Crime syndicates such as the Zemun Clan, Janjicari, Group America, and most notably of all, the Zemun Clan, became indescribably powerful and influential, not just on the territories of ex-Yugoslavia, but in all of Europe. Their rise to power turned Serbia into a lawless country where terror reigned supreme as they unified with the government in an effort to solidify their power. The syndicates didn't only function in a civilian environment, they also had their claws dug into the wars going on in Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Most notable of these were Arkan's Tigers, a paramilitary group led by Arkan Ražnjatović, one of Interpol's most wanted criminals, who was funded by the Serbian government. During their time of activity, not only did they smuggle and traffic drugs alongside regular goods, but also plundered and robbed war-torn civilian settlements, whilst murdering, sexually assaulting, and torturing civilians stuck in the crossfire. Now, unlike what your average Twitter liberal might tell you, Milosevic, although garnering significant popularity in the late 80s, already by the turn of the 90s had a significant number of his countrymen opposing him and his policies. Hell, in June 1990, Belgrade saw a huge protest against him where a large crowd gathered to burn a sizable picture of the Serbian leader, with which they were rewarded by getting their shit kicked in by the police. When the first of the Yugoslav Wars started a year later against Croatia, throughout Serbia there were numerous protests against military action and Milosevic's policies. Of course, as he was a dictator and ruled Serbia with an iron fist, having direct control over more or less the entirety of the nation's industry and organs, you can imagine how these protests were handled. This, alongside him creating the first ever fourth world country, made him incredibly unpopular by the end of the century. Of course, you wouldn't be able to see the public's opinion about their leader, as again, he controlled the media and insisted on instead playing a loop of war song music videos on TV, but in private conversations he had no control. So the discontent with him continuously grew in secret. What's important to note here is that Milosevic became extremely unpopular on practically all sides of the political spectrum in the country. The liberals from the start believed he was too radical, war-hungry, and opposed the wars Serbia perpetuated against its ex-countrymen. However, he was also unpopular popular amongst the right-wing nationalist circles he had propped up as his supporting base, many of whom considered him incompetent, a coward, not brutal enough, and not doing enough to support the Serbs to secede outside of Serbia, with some even calling him a traitor for not intervening directly. Nevertheless, both decided to cooperate regarding their one shared goal: take down Milosevic. As such, 20 political parties banded together into the same coalition, called the Democratic Opposition of Serbia, or DOS for short. In the presidential elections held in September 2000, despite all the voter intimidation, ballot manipulation, and other election meddling techniques, Vojislav Koštunica, the head and leader of the coalition, won the election with the majority of the vote of 51.71%, with Milosevic only garnering 38.24%. Yet, in typical dictator fashion, Milosevic rejected the results, claiming they were fraudulent and refused to give up office. But the people had enough and were not willing to take any more of Milosevic's bullshit. So, day and night, protests and mass demonstrations started to appear across the country, with a tenacity which could not be suppressed by the government. For the next couple of days, worker strikes were announced strike after strike in an effort to have Milosevic resign, the most notable of which was the Kolubara miners' strike. The Kolubara mine at this point was responsible for producing half of the country's electricity, and its workers were previously known for their notorious loyalty to the regime. So, when the coal miners laid down their tools and joined the masses in the demonstrations against Milosevic, it was something that sent shivers down the state's spine. Several days after the beginning of the strike, the police were sent to raid the Kolubara mine and arrest the protesters, whilst also brutally beating them up. A day after, on October 5th, DOS set a deadline for 3 p.m. for the dictator to resign. And again, Milosevic had no intention of doing so. As a result, between 500,000 and 1 million people stormed the streets of Belgrade, storming the parliament and seizing it for themselves. Another group of protesters decided to instead go after and seize the Radio Television Serbia building, known amongst the people as the main propaganda machine at the time, with one person coming with his bulldozer and breaking the doors of the building with it, and others utilizing bulldozers to disperse police blockades, for which the day would be coined as the Bulldozer Revolution. The next day, the Constitutional Court reversed their previous ruling and recognized Koštunica as the legitimate leader. The evening of the same day, Milosevic officially resigned and Koštunica was inaugurated as the official president of the country. Although Serbia had rid itself of Milosevic, its troubles were far from over, especially the ones of political nature. The start of the new millennium for Serbia, although initially optimistic, almost immediately after, the new elections ran into a pretty problematic hurdle: ideology. Remember how I mentioned that Milosevic was dethroned via a political party coalition of 20 members? Well, those parties lacked practically anything in common except that they wanted to depose Milosevic. After he was out of the picture, they ran into a problem of governing, as each had a different vision for the country. Vastly oversimplifying, half the nation wished to turn towards progressivism and liberalism, whilst the other half desired to go down the path of nationalism and conservatism. Now, the new president, Koštunica, although pro-democracy, was still a nationalist and conservative. In a way to balance out things, the coalition decided to elect Zoran Janjic, a charismatic ex-mayor of Belgrade and staunch liberal and progressive, as prime minister. The two of them would become an odd dynamic duo ruling the country. Both of them would make serious efforts to democratize the nation, but had vastly different approaches in handling policy otherwise. Koštunica would reject Serbia joining the EU and would fight vigorously for Serbia to keep control over Kosovo on the international stage. At the same time, Janjic was instead in favor of joining the European community and argued for closer ties with the West, while also trying to push through legislative reforms in an effort to liberalize the country, which Koštunica opposed. The political dances between Koštunica and Janjic did not mean that they did not collaborate together at all. On the contrary, both still put effort in reforming Serbia's internal workings into that of a democracy, as well as prosecuting former regime leaders responsible for war crimes committed in neighboring republics and handing them off to The Hague to stand trial, as was the case with Milosevic. Unbeknownst to many in the West, under their government and the ones that would later secede them from the DOS coalition, the Serbian state acknowledged many of the war crimes committed by the Serbs during the 90s. However, the approach taken in this deviated a bit to what the international community expected from Serbia. As in the case of Srebrenica, Koštunica would acknowledge the event as a massacre of civilians but would refuse to label it as genocide, a policy Serbia's future and current regime would continue to this day. However, the most important reforms that the government struggled internally to put into motion related to privatization, corruption, and lustration. Arguably the most significant of the three was privatization, where the government was supposed to transfer its ownership over various industry sectors to private owners. This process was started all the way back in the 90s with Milosevic's rise to power. However, as things under him took a turn for the worse, the transition was paused and postponed for a later date. When it was resumed by the Koštunica-Janjic government, although arguably better implemented than in other neighboring nations like Croatia and a vast majority of Eastern Europe, it was still botched and caused mass controversy amongst the public. For starters, with the NATO intervention, a large chunk of civilian factories were bombed and destroyed. When privatization came in full swing, the war-damaged industry was purchased by foreign investors for pennies on the dime, moving the little capital in the country out whilst exporting the responsibility of production to foreign hands. Alongside industrial sectors being given away to foreigners, local high government officials from the current and ex-regime, as well as criminal syndicate higher-ups, were able to acquire them and become oligarchs with unparalleled powers and influence over the country via the control of its key industry sectors like energy, transportation, media, and general manufacturing. In an attempt to mitigate the effects of botched privatization, Janjic became a strong proponent for pushing anti-corruption, anti-mafia, and lustration laws. The new legislation would aim to sanction and prevent the abuse of government power by bad actors, whilst also cleaning out the swamp from criminal syndicate influence, which had become more than a serious problem over the past decade. Now, although Janjic was immensely beloved by half of the country and seen as a visionary that was going to bring Serbia back onto the path of the righteous and guide it to its new golden age, there were also many that despised his guts. As I mentioned before, one of the big issues of the time in the country was the split between ideology, nationalism versus progressivism. The nationalist faction in the country hated Janjic's guts and took him as a traitor and sellout to the evil West that not long ago bombed our country and sided with the evil Albanian terrorists that wished to cleanse Serbs and Christians from their holy land of Kosovo. However, in his reforms, he angered much larger fish than the nationalists he inflamed with his rhetoric, the Mafia. Now, as I mentioned previously in this video, organized crime and the Mafia garnered tremendous influence and control over a vast chunk of the state during the free-for-all period of the 90s, where they became main suppliers of practically a huge chunk of goods that made it in the country. With that, they also made deep ties within the high ranks of the previous regime and ties with the newly formed oligarchs. As such, Janjic's new policies and laws directly threatened their way of life and their ability to garner millions through corruption and exploitation. And so, on March 12, 2003, when Janjic was commuting to work that morning at 12:23 p.m., a bullet from a rifle coming from not too far away positioned building pierced his heart while sitting inside his car, killing him instantly. This event shocked the nation to its core. Immediately after the murder, the assassin, Milorad Umek, but better known by his nickname Legija, was apprehended and jailed. Legija was a known member of the Zemun Clan and a former member of the Red Berrets, another one of Serbia's infamous paramilitary formations that were severely influenced and funded by the Milosevic regime and the notorious crime syndicates of the 90s. Although the guy who pulled the trigger was arrested, who put out the hit and why to this day remains unresolved, with many suspecting that the hit was organized by the members of the previous regime or even the current one, naming the entire operation as an inside job. Nevertheless, Janjic's assassination wasn't only devastating because it was the death of a man, it was tragic because with him the hopes for a bright Serbia died as well. For his funeral, hundreds of thousands hit the streets of Belgrade to escort their beloved leader for the last time. An event parallel only in the nation's history with the death of Tito, Yugoslavia's beloved dictator. With Prime Minister Janjicari's death, the fickle political balance in the country was severely offset, leaving the conservative and nationalist factions without a decent counterweight to check and balance out their policies. As such, the nation backtracked with its progress in democratization and liberalization of the country. Political infighting became prevalent between pro-EU liberals and anti-EU nationalists. Things further escalated in 2006 when Montenegro voted to become independent and seceded from the country. Then again in 2008, after years of failed negotiations between Serbia and the Kosovo government, when Kosovo unilaterally declared independence. Although Serbia was able to gulp down the loss of Montenegro, it wasn't able to do the same with Kosovo, as it was the nationalists' bread and butter to rile up the masses onto their side, due to its indispensable cultural, historic, and religious significance to the Serbian state and legacy. From that point on, nationalism again went on the rise and came to dominate political discourse as millions found it unacceptable to cooperate with the West, who is actively pushing for the humiliation and punishment of the Serbian people by taking their most important cultural and religious province from them. But that's not to say that liberalism and pro-EU sentiment disappeared. In 2009, the country officially applied to join the EU and became a candidate in 2012. As of writing this video in 2024, the country has opened 22 negotiation chapters and closed 2 out of 35 in the bid to join the Union, which makes it the second in progress closest to joining after Montenegro. However, in recent days, the enthusiasm for joining has gone down, with the last poll stating that about 43% of citizens wish to join while 25% are undecided. But to be fair, over the past decade, the sentiment has gone up and down depending on political happenings in and outside of the country. When it comes to organized crime, for a long time after Janjicari's passing, the crime syndicates were able to exert strong influence in all parts of the government. Although the liquidation of Janjic set back the prosecution, punishment, and prevention of these syndicates for years, in the 2010s major efforts were made in the fight against the Mafia to significantly limit their hold on the government and the lives of regular people. During the heyday of the Koštunica-Đinđić government, a path to democratization within Serbia was opened and policies for rooting out corruption were put in place. And even though with the events of 2003 these two were set back, progress in both fields nonetheless continued, albeit much slower and with a lot more road bumps. However, as of the mid-2010s, with the coming of President Vucic to power, institutions that were set up to fight authoritarianism and corruption have deteriorated similarly to Hungary, and the country has been moving towards the path of illiberalism and falling down in the ranking of its democratic institutions. Although the country has moved on since its dark age of the 90s, many issues that were relevant then still stoke the flames of Serbian politics today. Normalization between Serbia and most of its neighbors was relatively successful, with peace being achieved. However, tensions with Kosovo and Croatia continue due to the mistreatment and marginalization of the Serb minority within their territories. As a result, nationalist tendencies amongst Serbian society are still quite present, albeit much more subdued and less extreme to what they were. Economically, Serbia has strengthened, with real wage and capital growth being noticeable, as well as numerous infrastructure projects like the Miloš Veliki Highway and the Belgrade-Budapest high-speed railway being built. This improvement has resulted in the country having some of Europe's highest GDP growth rates. However, even so, due to the deterioration of the government and democratic institutions, corruption has been on a rise, which has shown cracks within the Serbian economic and political model. In the June 2020 national elections, Vucic's party, SNS, won 76% of the vote, which turned Serbia into what is essentially a one-party state. In 2023, the results for SNS depreciated to only winning 48% of the vote, but due to the opposition being extremely disorganized and prone to infighting, SNS and Vucic have continued to dominate the scene. What does the future hold for Serbia? God only knows, but hopefully it will be brighter days. Anyways, thank you all for watching. This video took more time to write and research than expected, so if you would be kind to leave a like and subscribe, that would be much appreciated. And as always, give me your thoughts in the comments. What are some of the major events in this time period that I missed? Let me know down below. Thank you to all the wonderful members for continually supporting me. If you wish to do so, become a member like them and have your name on screen, or go and buy some of my merch at theIronicShop.com. My name is Janos, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey, why are you leaving?